All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining tonight, for being with us and dealing with our tech difficulties at the beginning. But we're just so glad that you're here, and we're delighted to have Julie Holland on with us today. Julie, it's such a pleasure to get to host you. I have enjoyed working with you for a very long time now. We won't say how long.
Thank you.
Either of us look old, so we won't go there. But let's see. I would like to just turn things over to you, let you introduce yourself and share with us today. So I'm going to mute myself and let you talk.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you all again for hanging in there with us. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time introducing myself because you have been so patient waiting with us, but my name is Julie Holland. I'm an academic instructional coach for St. Louis Public School District. I've been doing that for the last 6 years. Before that, I was a classroom teacher for 16. And I have an English degree, my master's in educational leadership, and I have that K-12 reading specialist certification. So I am thrilled to be here talking to you tonight. And let's just go ahead and get going. So first of all, even through all the trials and tribulations with COVID-19 and all of our tech enhanced learning, I want to wish you all a happy Teacher Appreciation Week. I don't think any of us imagined we were going to end our year this way, but as a group, you know, teachers have always proven to be very flexible and innovative. And so, you know, no matter the challenge, somehow we just find the best way to make learning happen. Again, I'm really pleased to be presenting this conversation tonight because our system has been in the process of shifting to our standards-based grading. And again, that was something that was supposed to be happening this year with our, I was getting some message. That was supposed to be something that was happening as far as our report cards, and we're hoping that when we start back in the fall, whatever that may look like, that we're ready for that. So I just want to talk to you a little bit tonight about the process that we've been kind of going through and what that might look like. So our objectives for tonight are basically to develop a better understanding of our standards-based grading, what that is, what it could look like, examine the benefits and some potential struggles, and explore the preliminary instructional shifts that have to happen really before you actually do the reporting so that you have success. So before we actually begin our discussion of standards-based grading, I think it's important for us to just take one step back and consider the difference between what's referred to as standards-based learning and standards-referenced instruction. If you look at this information on your slide, according to the Glossary of Education Reform, this is how we would separate standards-based learning from standards-referenced teaching. So if you look at that, we're talking about standards referenced instruction. That is, on our part, we are always looking at the standards in our preparation of our instruction, while the standards-based learning refers to the practice of making sure that the students learn what they're taught. And again, we are always concerned with the proficiency of those the students' learning and those assessments in our grading and our academic reporting. Everything is focused on those standards and the students' proficiency. So if you think about it, are the standards then for the teachers or for the students? Well, if you're thinking standards referenced systems, which is I think probably where most of us are, and have been for probably going on 10 years or more. In a standards reference system, the teaching and testing are guided by the standards. In a standards-based system, teachers work to ensure that students actually learn the expected material as they progress in their education. So again, another way to look at that is that the standards reference refers to the inputs, what's taught, and the standards based is focused on the outputs, what is learned.
Julie, I just want to say here that this image here just made this so much more concrete for me. I was so excited when I saw this. I was like, wow, this I think probably is like the best thing I've seen yet that just really makes this make sense. So thank you for putting this in.
Absolutely.
I really liked it.
Yeah, and you know, when I looked at this too, it was kind of an aha moment for me as well. And I know that for most of the time that I was in the classroom, or especially early on, you know, the standards were always there to guide my input. And actually, honestly, in my earliest years of teaching, way back a long time ago, I'm sure that the students didn't even really know which standards we were covering. They just knew that they had assignments to complete. But again, we know that in the last 10 years, the ownership of those standards and the output has shifted to the learner. And so that's where the standards-based grading really comes in. So the shift to standards-based or proficiency-based learning brings us to, again, like I said, the shift in the grading that has to naturally sort of follow it. So if you look at these different explanations of standards-based grading, you can kind of see, as I pulled out the common threads, the measuring and tracking of student learning in relation to standards, not to other students. And we're going to go ahead and explore how assessing and reporting that student achievement changes when we take that standards-based grading approach. Again, I found this great graph, this nice organizer in Schoology, and we're going to break it down a little bit so you don't have to worry about seeing all that tiny detail. But if you take a few moments to look at this graphic organizer, you can see that our traditional grading systems and our standards-based grading systems do have some big rocks in common. But it's the data collecting and reporting of student achievement that is vastly different. So these are those big rocks that were in the middle of that graphic organizer. This is kind of our comfort zone. These are the things that we don't argue about. We all kind of feel comfortable with when we think about either type of grading. That in either system, you can assign a letter grade or a number grade. Whatever we're doing, grading, it's intended to convey student progress. We, in each standard traditional grading and in our standards-based grading, we're using multiple pieces of evidence to show student achievement. And both systems can be used in elementary and secondary education. But once we get to the details on that graphic organizer of what and how we're reporting student achievement, this is where we begin to see a different picture. So let's just take a quick comparative look here. So first of all, based on our standards-based grading is based on learning goals and performance standards versus the types of assessments, quizzes, homework, participation, etc. Second difference, standards-based grading is based on different proficiency levels for standards and not on a percentage system or a letter grade. The next one, standards-based grading only measures the achievement of standards. We can't throw in extra credit. We can't give zeros for assignments that aren't turned in because that's not measuring the achievement of a standard. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Another sticking point, standards-based grading, the grades are based on the most recent evidence. And again, we're going to dig into this a little bit more too. It is not an average of the different assignments for a cumulative grade. And the last big difference, excuse me, standards-based grading has multiple grades given per course. Essentially, there's a grade, a numerical value of some sort, essentially for each standard taught. There is not one overall grade for the course if you're looking at standards-based grading in the truest sense. Every standard is going to have an assessed evaluation. So if it follows that we make these shifts in data collection, then we have to make a shift in the way that we report it. So that's kind of where the parents get their first real look at standards-based grading, is in the report card. So there's not one right way to report standards proficiency, but there are some basic traits that occur for each type. So first of all, you're going to notice always some sort of rubric rating scale. Right here in the middle, you can see that. So this is a 1 to 4 grading scale, which is pretty common. So mastery or exceeding mastery is a 4. Meeting the standard is a 3. And again, that's a tough conversation with parents who have those straight A students who are used to getting all 4s or straight A's. Suddenly, they may see a lot of 3s, and that might be disconcerting for them. And you'll notice that the standards are listed, and then each standard gets its own indicator. So, and you're going to notice on this report card, attendance is noted, and there's probably some place on this report card, but we're not seeing it, but there's probably a place for behavior. But again, those are never going to be factored into the standards reporting. Here's another way that it might look on a report card. Here's just like the social studies section of a report card. We can see again that the standards, although they're really quite broad in this example, there's that 4-point scale. And we can also see that NA for reporting periods where those are not assessed. Finally, in this example, we can see how some systems are giving detailed reporting of what they consider to be power standards. You'll see that noted. The power standards, if that's not a term you're using, in our system, that means that those are the ones that are deemed the most essential, especially for standardized assessing. So right now, at least in our district, we only focus on power standards, just like in this district, for English language arts and math. I think the next step would be probably, we'd like to see that incorporated in-depth reporting for our science and social studies standards as well. So if we pause and reflect for just a moment, thinking about what we talked about so far, you might just want to share in the chat where your school district or your school is in that continuum of standards-based implementation. Are you kind of just stepping into it? You're just beginning to explore the idea of standards-based grading. So you might just say we're at a 1. Maybe you're at that 2, where you're using that standards-based learning mindset, but you still have that traditional grading system. Or maybe you're a 3 and you have completely shifted to a standards-based grading approach. Your report cards reflect your work in the classroom. Parents have been well versed and you're well on your way. So I saw a 1. I think I said it earlier. There's a 2 from Sonia. Our district, I would say, has been at a 2 for about 3 years while we've been doing the preliminary work. And again, we're hoping that if things go back to what feels like a quote unquote normal school year in the fall, that our report card might actually reflect that work. Right, thank you for sharing. Let's go ahead and keep going because I know you all were so patient early on waiting for us. So, what is our why for changing our grading practices? What's your why? We hear that phrase often because I think we believe that if we know the why behind our choices, that it's going to motivate us, and we're going to find the how to do it. It may be really difficult, but we're going to find the how to help us be successful. So we're going to go ahead and take a few moments to consider that why behind the ongoing shift to standards-based grading and some of those potential benefits for student learning. Again, in this presentation, I didn't try to create an exhaustive list for us. I just included the benefits that are most often noted. So the first benefit that many people report for standards-based grading is that there's better feedback. Again, in that better feedback, the evaluating of how well students meet measurable milestones and objectives improves our instruction for the individual student, and it allows the student, again, then more ways to demonstrate they've learned the material before moving on. That constant back and forth between student and teacher so they can improve their performance. So we all know that when we slap a numerical grade on a paper, it's really difficult to ever get students to go back and do it again, to do it better. But by providing feedback on what they need to do to move up, more and more feedback, less of the numerical values. So again, I will share an example of how this practice started shifting for me in the last few years that I was in the classroom. I was a secondary teacher for a long time. And as I began shifting to a more standards-informed student data gathering and reflection, I also began to let those older students kind of analyze their unit tests. And so I let them start breaking them down by how well they did by the standards. So I gave them a recording form and listed each question, told them which questions, again, matched up with which standards were on that test. And almost every student could find a silver lining in their assessment, even ones who may not have passed the exam as a whole, because by breaking down that assessment, they could see how they might have at least mastered 1 or 2 standards for that unit. And then they had better feedback. They knew what they needed to do going forward for the next assessment, or what we needed to reteach so they could master those standards as well. The second benefit that's often noted is better understanding of quality. Well, what do we mean by that? So in this ASCD article called 7 Reasons for Student-Based Grading, Patricia Scriffany states that the quality of performance in the adult workforce matters. We all know that. Quality is important, and that it's essential that we help students learn the value of quality work. How do we teach that? We create that environment where standards can and must be met, and where students are not permitted to just submit substandard work without being asked to revise it. I think that's the critical piece here. They don't just take a failing moment and move on. They're asked to keep working on that standard so that then they can move forward once we feel like they've hit proficiency. So another benefit in our standards-based grading, those grades, again, are based on the most recent evidence. So what does that mean? We're going to look at this example, and you can look at it for a little bit with me. At first, that seems kind of counterintuitive. If we've been keeping a traditional grade book for a while, we assume we want to see a body of a student's work with several quizzes, tests, homework assignments, all pulled together to decide if a student has a good understanding of a concept. But let's just take a minute to look at it another way. So let's compare Tricia Traditional over here and Stanley Standards Based. It's the same class, same everything, except the way that they are scored. If you look, let's look at Tricia Traditional for a minute. So again, she struggles. She's receiving her low marks on her classwork and homework, but she's learning from her mistakes. So you can see that she gradually improved. So by test number 2, she's at a 19 out of 20. But what happens when we are taking those 4 grades and we are giving her the cumulative score for that effort? Her final mark is a 72.5 or a C minus. If you look at Stanley's standards, he also struggled. He began his quarter learning from his mistakes though, and his assessments improved just like Trisha's. And in the end, his final mark in a standards-based class would be a 3, that he is achieving that standard. So same class, same everything, but in the end, Trisha is being penalized for those low marks she made early on, and Stanley is not. So if you think about this for a minute, why would we want to penalize students for having a slow start? Isn't our objective to really help them achieve mastering? Didn't Trisha reach mastering by test number 2? But yet she's still being penalized for that slow start. So that's why in standard-based grading, taking that most recent evidence is a better reflection of what the student is achieving.
Julie, I'm going to say that was another aha moment there. I don't think I had ever realized how the grading actually worked. I understood the 1 through 4, but I didn't realize that you kept like that last grade there where you achieved. And I think that would be so important, especially for struggling learners. I know I have a grandbaby that's just, well, I actually have 2 grandbabies that are dyslexic, and I think how they struggle to get up to a mark. Yes. And to be able to get there and not be penalized would be such an emotional boost for them. So you're bringing me on over, girl. Keep up the work.
I mean, really, isn't our goal to get them to mastery? So why do we want to punish them because they didn't have maybe the background knowledge when they walked in the door with us? That's not their fault. So if our objective is to help them learn and we all reached our objective, we wouldn't want to be penalized either. So yes, again, we're going with the most recent evidence in standards-based grading and not that average. All right, another benefit that's often noted is it's really a better communication tool for parents. We talked about the feedback between teacher and student and that ongoing formative assessing. We do that all the time anyway. But for a communication tool for parents, again, you think about what a standard report card tells you. It makes it a little less mysterious, and what they see has more meaning. The parents are aware of exactly what their child knows and is able to do. And then there can be a true conversation about what the next steps are for progress. So rather than just saying, you know, your 2nd grader is failing English language arts and he has a 50, how much more valuable is it to be able to talk to the parent about which standards the child has mastered, maybe, and which ones they haven't, so the parent knows what they can help do at home, how they can offer that child more support. And parents are empowered to increase their child's confidence and help their students set some goals. Again, if we really want our parents to be partners in education, this is the way that they can have that fuller understanding of their own child's strengths and weaknesses. You know, how can a parent provide any additional support based on just that letter or percentage grade alone? And our last big rock for our benefits for standards-based grading, if you think of it, it really is a more equitable way of grading. How many of us have heard a student, or maybe we've been that student on our own, say, you know, I think I got a bad grade in the class because the teacher just didn't like me? Well, unfortunately, grading can be affected by some implicit and unintended biases. By grading solely on clearly defined academic standards with a precise rubric in hand, it is much easier to maintain a level of equity. If you look at our examples again, if you remove class points for behavior, that eliminates that implicit bias from grading. If you remove homework points, that helps eliminate unintended achievement disparities based on a child's economic disparities. When I think of the children that are in my building that I service, to expect them to be able to complete homework is a real challenge. We have been out of school, for example, since the middle of March, and some of our children were just this week, able to access any sort of technology, and they're still lacking the internet at their homes. We provided hotspots. A lot of them don't have a quiet place to sit and do homework. So they don't have supplies at home, basics that some of us just take for granted. Many children don't have. So why, again, would we want to punish children unintentionally for economic disparities, for homework that they can't complete? And again, a focus on making grades equitable not only provides that sharper lens through which teachers can interrogate and examine how they grade, but it also provokes an ethical obligation to change. When we really think about how we're grading and what we want to remove, we can do better. And I like that phrase, when we know better, we hope we do better. So it's not all a bed of roses. If it were a perfect system, I'm sure that we would have all jumped at the chance to do this 10 years ago. So what's been stopping us? Well, we're going to take a look again at just a few of the pitfalls that are brought up in conversations about standards-based grading. So some critics have mentioned that there is this emphasis on standards at the expense of engagement in learning, and that standards-based grading may even make things worse by getting kids so focused on just how they can do better that they really don't care what the lesson is. They just want to see a better score. So again, being motivated by mastery of rubrics, that's going to happen with some students anyway. Some fear that teachers will also become mired down in standards progression at the expense of enriching learning experiences. In other words, I'm just trying to keep a great data tracker that shows that all of my students are at a 3 or 4, and so I'm just teaching to a standards type testing environment. So that is a big pitfall that people can fall into really easily if we're not careful in our planning. Another pitfall or con, sometimes it's brought up, is the idea that students are offered multiple opportunities and ways through which to demonstrate their proficiency. So that seems like a really good thing again. Seems like a compelling argument in support of standards-based grading, but research indicates that for some students, it becomes counterproductive. If you think about the idea that we don't get more hours in a school day, we don't get more days in the school year, sometimes the students lose motivation and the teachers become quickly overwhelmed, juggling classrooms full of students who are not only working on current standards that we have to keep moving as a whole class, but trying to go back and reteach and move students along on other standards that they haven't mastered yet. So it becomes a real juggling act for the students sometimes. It can be overwhelming if we're not careful, and it can be quite overwhelming for teachers. They're burdened with balancing new material and those reassessments and basically individualized learning tracks and lots of small groups. And this is kind of the point that I was making earlier, that again, some people would claim that standardized testing is really what's dictating this idea of classroom assessing and practicing through standards-based grading, that all we want to do is improve test scores, and that we have redesigned the schools around those tests. And again, we all know that tests are important, but they are just one indicator of educational quality. If we're removing some of those other skills like cooperative learning, if those aren't being thrown into the equation of grading, it seems like we are devaluing skills for students who are maybe not as academically strong. Again, there are ways to work around it, but it is a concern. So how do we praise students for things that are intangibles? So even when you examine those pitfalls, research does show that a standards-based mindset, again, referenced, paired with the standards-based grading, correlate to that higher academic achievement. Again, the academic achievement. Therefore, it's critical that we link our assessments and reporting to those standards as well. So you are already implementing that standards referenced instruction, and you're using many of the key components of standards-based learning in your formative assessing. So the grading is that last link, aligning your assessments and the reporting. It may not be a perfect grading system, but basically research supports that it is a vast improvement over traditional grading in most aspects. So if we have this strong why and we're feeling that it is the right direction for us, then it's time to dig into how we start approaching that shift. So now that we've come to the how, we want to do justice to our students and to our own instructional practices. And standards-based grading just requires a lot of preliminary and ongoing work. And remember, that's often noted as one of those pitfalls. It is, and it can be overwhelming, at least at the onset. Many of you may be well on your way. I didn't see too many of those in the comments, and you might be already doing a lot of this work, so that the shift in grading is really just the culmination of your research, your PLC work, your formative assessment grading. Your work in your district may be about getting fully aligned and communicating the new look of grading to parents. But again, speaking for myself, we've been doing this process for a few years, and we're just now ready to implement the actual changes. But you'll see there's a lot of work, there are a lot of steps to get us going in the right direction and be ready to accurately report our student achievement based on those proficiency standards. So the first thing we're going to look at is that deep dive into the standards and the outcomes. We have to know those standards well. We have to establish criteria for success within our building. They have to be consistent across a building, a grade span, and hopefully if you're in a larger district, across your district in each grade span. We want to create assessments that align with what we've agreed upon as the criteria for success. We want to create an aligned grading rubric. And it's really important for us to think about what we think a student exemplar would look like that's grade appropriate. We have to align the grading level promotion with the assessment of the standards. In other words, which of those standards have to be mastered before we're going to promote students? How many of those targeted standards have to be mastered in order to be promoted to that next grade level? And then how are you going to communicate all of that to the parents? So again, it's an exhaustive work at the get-go. And that's why it takes a while to really get your feet wet and then jumping into this deep dive. So let's go ahead and talk about that first thing that is on our list of things. Again, this is standards-based grading, so it makes sense that the first step is to really unpack your standards, and hopefully that's something that you've seen and you've started working in with your PLCs maybe. But again, this is where our work begins, and this is a typical unpacking of a standard. When we talk about unpacking it, we talk about being very specific in what we believe a student should know about a standard, what a student should understand, and what a student should do, be able to do to show proficiency in that standard. So again, this is a lot of work and it's a lot of thought, a lot of research sometimes, but fortunately, many districts have already begun this work. There are plenty of resources available for reference. You can look on a lot of different schools' websites and see that they have unpacked standards for their own district. But it is important, even if you use some of those for models, it's important as teachers to use those as guides and then view them with your own critical eye. Ask yourself, do I agree with the points they've made? Do I feel that the prerequisites or descriptors of mastery are appropriate? Is there anything missing? Spend time actually digging in yourself. Sets you up to think deeply about what you believe mastery and proficiency will look like for your students. So you've unpacked the standard, and now it's time to determine what constitutes proficiency. So here's a typical 5th grade social studies standard. And you can see each level of proficiency builds on the one before it. So if a numerical scale is then applied to those descriptors, we'd probably use a 4-point scale with 1 below proficiency, and again, that 4 at above proficiency. And again, the challenge will come when this shows up on a report card or in a parent-teacher conference in explaining to some of those traditional A quote-unquote students and their parents that 3 is actually proficiency. And they may not have all 4s, but that's okay. They have still mastered that standard. They just haven't gone above and beyond it. All right, so we've unpacked the standard. We've determined maybe what our criteria for success on a proficiency scale would look like. And then we have to decide, based on those items, what we believe the assessment needs to look like. If you take a moment and read that opening paragraph by the National Council for Social Studies, you'll see that they are outlining their beliefs about assessments. This goes back to that grade 2 standard that we unpacked. And the assessment is the moment that teachers make the lasting impact. One of the fears of the standards-based grading that I mentioned earlier is that we become obsessed with just mining for data and that we begin negating other skills. We could assess students in that standardized testing format, simply asking questions that check off our proficiency descriptors, or we can assess, like this assessment, in a way that, as the National Council for Social Studies says, makes an impact on students beyond promoting social understanding and civic efficacy. So if you take a moment to think about the lasting impact an authentic assessment such as this example would have on student learning versus just that paper pencil assessment, I think you can see that there can be a nice balance in assessing the standards and still giving students an opportunity to show other skills of presentation and other again, maybe non-tangibles that they have. So as we wrap it up for the night, we think about standards-based grading, and it's really not as much a shift in our thinking or our basic philosophy of instruction, but it is a shift to align our grading practices with our ongoing work in providing that formative feedback that drives our instruction and student achievement. So standards-based grading really kind of requires that coordinated work among the teachers. If you have a curriculum department, your assessment department, you have to create a clear vision of what we're grading and how we're grading. Like any change, it requires a lot of professional development and communication with all the stakeholders, especially parents in that last step. So as we wrap it up, I just want you to reflect for a moment and share with us, if you don't mind, some of the points you discussed today and thought about today in the webinar, and what you think your next step might be in standards-based grading. Or even if you're not planning on moving to that standards-based grading system just yet, did you have a takeaway from the webinar that will improve your instructional practices? If you'll share, that would be great. I'd love to see your comments.
While we're waiting on some people to post their thoughts, I take away from this a little bit, Julie, about when I was in the classroom, I really liked using a rubric. And the reason I liked using the rubric is because it explained everything so well to the students. It gave them so much more feedback than a traditional assessment would have. And so I'm almost kind of liking that into that feel of, one, you're giving them the goal and helping them to know where it is you want them to go, and then letting them know at what point they've reached it. It looks like we've got a few people putting in some ideas here.
Absolutely, Pam. The rubrics are a crucial part of standards-based grading. And really what you're doing is sharing those criteria for success with the kids. That shouldn't be a mystery. How they're going to be assessed should never be a mystery to your kids. So if you've decided what a 1 looks like and what a 4 looks like for a particular standard, sharing that at the beginning of the process and showing them what you believe a student exemplar would look like of your best work, that quality we want them to achieve for us, that gives them that mark. They know the target. When we talk about the learning target for the day, give them the target. We want them to know exactly where they're going, and then it's our job to help them get there.
Yes, absolutely. And did you see the post here from Erica? She is a self-contained first-year teacher with a special needs class. And how would this work for someone in that position?
Well, again, and it's honestly an ideal position because you are looking at those grades. If you have IEPs for your students, you're already creating goals for them, and it is. I'm going to be honest. One of the pitfalls that's often brought up is that it doesn't feel like standards-based grading rewards growth, because maybe we have a student who starts very far behind, and no matter how hard they work through the year, they can't achieve that mastery or proficiency level. And that is true. But if we know what the goals are that we're setting for our students in those self-contained classrooms, maybe your student isn't, even though your student might be a 5th grade age student, maybe that student is still working on 2nd grade skills or 1st grade skills.
Well, Julie, if that student who comes in very low and can't reach mastery, how much better served would they have been in a traditional grading situation? Wouldn't it have possibly been as detrimental, if not more, with getting a lot of negative number grades and not getting feedback. So this has been really excellent.
And it is the opportunity for them to continue working towards that. It's never just the one and done. I gave you the test and you're finished. We're always going back and reteaching, trying to continue to build those standards anyway. But you're right, and you can, in your formative assessing, you're still going to see growth. So even if they don't reach a level of proficiency on a particular standard, if they started at a 1 and their most current one is a 2, you still showed growth.
Right.
So there are different ways to interpret that data as well.
Well, I think this has been really excellent tonight. I think you've given us a lot to think about and to really consider for a change. And it looks like our participants have really enjoyed it tonight, Julie. So I just want to say thank you again. Thank you to the participants who hung in there with us. All of you will be hearing from me. We're just so glad that you were there. Julie, thank you for hanging in there. That was tough on your end trying to get everything to work. And I'm glad we were able to make that happen. So thank you so much. And Julie, I'll be back with you again.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for being here and have a great night. We will get this recording out to you on Monday.